So welcome everyone to Hegel 1313, and welcome Professor Seyla Benhabib, who will be speaking this evening about Marcuse's reading of Hegel, and Professor Benhabib's reading of Hegel as well, fortunately. Let me just say a few words about the seminar and this evening's seminar before introducing Professor Benhabib and then turning it over to her. So, as you know, there are three questions we are addressing in this seminar. Three very specific questions. The first is, what work does a critical theorist like Herbert Marcuse this evening operate on Hegel? The second is, how does that work on Hegel shape their critical theory and praxis? And the third is what we can learn from that today for our own political practice in these times of crisis, of mounting authoritarianism, if not fascism, of times of government repression. So those are the three guiding questions. And of course, Herbert Marcuse is a remarkable place to start. Remarkable because here's a critical thinker who, in the depth of the most harrowing times, 1940, the outbreak of war in Europe, the rise of fascism, perhaps the apex of fascism in Europe, turns to Hegel for guidance, sits down and writes this 430-page book on Hegel, Reason and Revolution, Hegel and the Rise of Social Theory, published in 1941. Now, that's a stunning fact in itself. And it's what guides this seminar and this seminar this evening. To address the first two questions, what work did Marcuse do on Hegel, and how did that influence his critical theory and praxis? We couldn't be more blessed tonight than to have Professor Seyla with us. Perhaps one of the persons, the person, the most perfect person on earth for this session. The person most familiar, right, with Marcuse's early writings on Hegel. Professor Benhabib translated Marcuse's first 1932 book, Hegel's Ontology and the Theory of Historicity, which was published in 1987. And in a way, as Professor Benhabib mentions in her introductory essay, and we'll mention it this evening, it was possibly a habilitation, an accompanying work that would have allowed him then to have doctoral students in Germany. And in a way, Seyla Benhabib, in translating this work and introducing it, was doing almost a thèse complémentaire, right, to her own work, her own first book, which was the magisterial Critique, Norm, and Utopia, a study of foundations of critical theory, published in 1986, so the year before, right? And the way I think of it is, well, in France at least, there used to be a tradition when it was a thèse d'état that you would do a thèse complémentaire, which was often a translation. So you can think here of Foucault's translation of Kant's Anthropology. That was his thèse complémentaire. And so 1 year after the book is published, Critique, Norm, and Utopia, the translation of Marcuse's Hegel's Ontology and the Theory of History is published. And it's also remarkable to have Professor Benhabib with us here because, in a way, she is both a critical thinker who's going to help us think and understand Marcuse, herself also a critical thinker who returned to Hegel and was shaped by that. So in a way, she is also a subject of our seminar series. So the combination tonight is going to be particularly interesting. Now, for Marcuse, of course, the work on Hegel then ultimately pushes forward towards Eros and Civilization in 55, and then, of course, One-Dimensional Man in 64, and other important essays, Counter-Revolution and Revolt in 72, and Essay on Liberation, which we'll be mentioning and discussing. For Seyla Benhabib, the work on Marcuse and Hegel pushed in different directions, one of which, of course, was questions of subjectivity and modernity and the self, in Professor Benhabib's book, Situating the Self, published in 92. Another area was cosmopolitanism and questions of universalism and questions of multiculturalism, which we will in part be talking about this evening, and in books such as The Claims of Culture. And then an enormous body of work, and perhaps what is right now taking most of your attention, on questions of exile, statelessness, and migration. And of course, that's the title of a book from 2018 and the focus of a lot of work right now. The recipient of the Hannah Arendt Prize for Political Thinking last year, delivered in Bremen. Professor Benhabib is the Eugene Mayer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy Emeritus at Yale, a professor here at Columbia, and most importantly, a longtime senior fellow at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. So with that, let me please turn it over, with your help, to Professor Seyla Benhabib.
Thank you, Bernard, for this kind introduction. This material is not easy. It is challenging. Sometimes you may think that language is doing us injustice or is not there to capture thought completely, but bear with me. And I hope that this reading of Marcusa on Hegel, partially Heidegger, and me on all four or three will bear some fruit. Now, one of the central theses of this year's 13 seminars on Hegel is that we are living through Hegelian times. This claim was puzzling to me because Hegel himself believed that he was living through the Neue Zeit, new times, a new period in human history when the French Revolution, emerging commodity relations, and Reformed Christianity came together, Hegel thought, to give rise to a new principle in history, the principle of subjectivity. The emergence of individual freedom and the recognition of the right of the individual to such freedom in state and society. But what kind of freedom? A freedom which, in Hegel's view, extended from free market relations to the free pursuit of one's understanding of the good, reaching to free choice of spouse or partner, and to the free choice of a profession. In other words, classical liberal freedoms in economics, civil society, and personal life is recognized by the modern state. Are we living then in Hegelian times in the sense that a new alternative principle of freedom has emerged in our times? It seems to me rather that we are living through times when the spirit of freedom, liberal or post-liberal, has been killed. But let us not get ahead of ourselves and try to think with Hegel first. Having announced the coming of this new age, Hegel, as his critics pointed out, and Marx above all, compromised the spirit of revolution and the principle of freedom by claiming that the institutions of the reformed Prussian state were adequate to give such freedom an ethical home, crucial concept, Sittlichkeit. What is rational is actual, he wrote, and what is actual is rational. From the philosophy of right, the preface. Was vernünftig ist, ist wirklich, und was wirklich ist, ist vernünftig. Now, if by what is actual, Hegel simply meant what exists, then we can accuse him not only of accommodating himself to the institutions of the Prussian state, but of being a poor philosopher who simply justified what exists. But if what is rational is not yet actual, does not yet exist, then we can see the reformist kernel of Hegel's political thought, namely to transform reality such that it corresponds to rationality. Or, as Marcusa puts it in Reason and Revolution, the realization of freedom is not a fact, but a task. Let me go back to the phrase. What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. Each of these terms requires careful unpacking, for they do not mean what we assume them to mean. The actual is not just what exists. It is the conceptual, the conflictual unity of the existence and its essence as grasped by the concept. What does this mean? It's really not as difficult as it sounds. We talk of a true work of art. We say this is not really a work of art. It's a piece of imitation. We talk of true friendship. We say this is a friendship that rests on material interests alone. We say this is not a true university. It's run by the trustees. It's not dedicated to the principle of knowledge and research. Now, in each of these claims, we have a standard of normativity, what Hegel calls the concept of a work of art, the concept of a university, the concept of friendship. Our social life is composed of the actual, in the sense of this unity of normativity and what exists. Of course, works of art exist. Of course, friendships exist. Universities exist. But what Hegel means by what is actual, das Wirkliche, is when the existence corresponds to its essence, to its normativity, as understood and explained by thinking. Now, what about reason? And we will come back to this concept again and again in this lecture. For us, reason is the capacity for problem solving. We say to someone, it's not rational for you to spend your money in this particular way, right? We say it is not rational to want to, Hegel's example, to want to learn to swim without getting wet, right? But for Hegel, reason is not the capacity for problem solving, for instrumental thinking alone. Hegel has a term for such capacities, which he takes from Kant, and which is common in Germany. It's Verstand, it's understanding. Reason, Vernunft, by contrast, is speculative thinking. It is what grasps reality not only as substance, but as subject. In other words, reason is what grasps the objective world as brought about by the conflictual unity of subject and object. Again, what does this mean? Kant defined external reality, existence of things under universal laws. And most of the time in our everyday life, we treat the world as it is, simply as objects, as substance, chairs that we can pull, tables that we can bump into. But everything around us, and Hegel's claim is including nature, has a historicity. Everything around us has come to be. In that sense, it is the unity of substance and object, subject. But such unity can only be expressed systematically as a whole. It is not a statement of identity. It needs an exposition, it needs a development, it needs an exegesis. But there are problems in this claim. And here we should heed a very early warning that Marcusa once again points to. And I want to read a passage from Marcusa's preface to Reason and Revolution, because I'm actually going to both agree and disagree with Marcusa. I'll do some dialectical thinking.
And this is the 1960
preface, right? And it is third paragraph, and it's the sentence that begins, I believe it's the idea of reason itself which is the undialectical element in Hegel's philosophy. Now, this is very puzzling. The idea of reason comprehends everything and ultimately absorbs everything because it has its place and function in the whole. And the whole is beyond good and evil, truth and falsehood. It may even be justifiable logically, as well as historically, to define reason in terms, now listen carefully, which includes slavery, the Inquisition, child labor, concentration camps, gas chambers, and nuclear preparedness. These may well have been integral parts of that rationality which has governed the recorded history of mankind. I don't think so. And certainly have been readings of Hegel. The French say, to comprendre, c'est tout pardonner. To understand everything is to forgive everything. But we know that Hegel explicitly denounced slavery as contrary to human essence. I'm not exactly sure what he would have said about child labor, but I'm fairly sure, quite convinced that for Hegel, concentration camps, the Inquisition would not have been acceptable. So Marcusa is not consistent, actually, in this claim about Hegel's concept of reason, because he himself adds at the very end of the book, in our time, the rise of fascism calls for a reinterpretation of Hegel's philosophy. Okay? So this is the end of the 1941 book that Marcuse wrote when members of the Frankfurt School had left Europe and had temporarily settled in New York with the hospitality of Columbia University and were continuing the Institute for Social Research. Marcuse, on the one hand, warns about the quietistic tendencies which comprehending the truth as the whole may imply, while also seeing emancipatory elements in Hegel's theory that are hostile to fascist theory and practice. So does the claim that these are Hegelian times mean that Hegel is the philosopher of the Heritage Foundation? Or should we read Hegel as an anti-fascist? Marcusa himself, and contrary to the early preface, or to this paragraph in the early preface, which I'm not, Marcusa ends Reason and Revolution by citing Carl Schmitt, whom he calls the one serious political theorist of National Socialism. According to Schmitt, and here is Marcusa quoting Schmitt, on the day of Hitler's ascent to power, Hegel, so to speak, died. Yeah? Remember that phrase. On the day of Hitler's ascent to power, Hegel died. Page 419, Reason and Revolution. Reading Hegel means encountering the tremendous ambition of the human intellect in seeking to comprehend nature, society, and mind itself in the most thorough way. Yet it also means being astonished occasionally when the power of negativity comes to an arbitrary rest and much unreason is smuggled into the system. Twice in his career, Herbert Marcuse delved into such Hegelian depths and explored the ambivalence of Hegel's thought. But he also saw in Hegel's philosophy the path towards a critical theory of society, which his colleagues in the Frankfurt School had begun to develop in exile. Let me then just say a few biographical things about Marcuse before delving into his first work. Herbert Marcuse, 1898-1979, is, as many of you know, along with Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, among the most illustrious members of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. In addition to the two works on Hegel, which we are discussing in this session, as Bernard mentioned, he is also the author of Soviet Marxism, 1958, Eros and Civilization, 1955, One-Dimensional Man, 1964. Unlike Adorno and Horkheimer, Marcuse refused to return to Germany after the war. And although he continued to live in the United States with occasional trips to Germany, his trip to Berlin is very, very well known, with crowds of German students hanging from the rafters listening to Marcuse. He became the one member of the Frankfurt School, even more than Adorno himself, in whom the 1968 student movement trusted and found a voice. With works such as Repressive Tolerance, Counter-Revolution and Revolt, and in particular an essay on liberation, Marcuse gave voice to critiques of consumerism and capitalism and the desire of the younger generation to drop out and turn off. I'm not sure that's the exact phrase, but whatever. Now, his essay on Eros and Civilization, which brought together an analysis of Freudian reality principle with Marx's analysis of labor time into a powerful synthesis, is worth mentioning also because it contained many themes critical of masculine sexuality and acknowledged the polymorphous perversity of all human desire. These themes were then picked up by psychoanalytic feminists such as Jessica Benjamin and Nancy Chodorow, and contributed greatly to this effervescence of psychoanalysis and feminism in early critical theory. But what was motivating Marcuse to read Hegel in 1932 and then again in 1941? Like Marcuse, I'm convinced of the emancipatory potential of Hegelian philosophy, and though in my recent work I have pivoted toward Kant, I never left Hegel behind. Like the later Marcuse, I too have followed the path from philosophy to a critical theory of society. Now, let's go back to Hegel's ontology and the theory of historicity. As I explained in the translator's introduction, Marcuse had received his doctorate at the University of Freiburg in 1922 with a thesis on the Deutsche Künstlerroman. But the publication of Heidegger's Being and Time in 1927 made him decide to go back to Freiburg. He was at the time working in a bookstore in Berlin. He wasn't in Freiburg. Along with Hannah Arendt, Leo Strauss, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Karl Lewith, Hans Jonas, and many others, the who and who of German philosophy of that period, Marcuse heard the siren's call from the magician from Meßkirch, as Heidegger was referred to at this time, and Arendt's famous words, "A philosopher has come, maybe one can learn to think again." Now, after much research, I came to the conclusion that this work, Marcuse's work, was never formally submitted to Heidegger. And I have found no evidence of the claim that Heidegger had rejected it on political grounds, although there are different statements. What is clear is that Marcuse's hopes for an academic career in Germany, for which this would serve as his Habilitationsschrift, his second thesis, the Vigna Legend, that would give him the right to teach, that these were all dashed with Hitler's coming to power in 1933. Still, what was Marcuse up to in this book? Marcuse had already been dabbling in historical materialism. And in his other writings of this period, which are sometimes referred to as Heideggerian Marxism, he was seeking a synthesis between Heidegger's existential phenomenology and Marxist theory. And he wrote a number of essays on George Lukács and Karl Korsch between 1998 and 1933, whose work he explicitly praised. He developed an interpretation of Marxist theory, like Lukács and Korsch, that was opposed to the communist orthodoxy, in particular simplistic materialistic readings of historical materialism and Marxist theory of history as a teleological class warfare that would end up in the dictatorship of the proletariat. But he was also opposed to the reformism of the Second International that saw participation in bourgeois governments and institutions as the path towards the transformation of society. A lot of these connections are latent in Hegel's ontology, which moves, I agree, at a frightening level of abstraction. The ambition of the young Marcuse is to show that the most advanced bourgeois philosophies of this period, and these concepts may be somewhat estranging us, like, the bourgeois philosophy of the period, right? But by this he meant Dilthey, Husserl, and Heidegger. And he wanted to show, in particular with reference to Heidegger and Dilthey, that they had to go beyond the frameworks which they had constructed towards what? Towards a discovery of some kind of Marxist theory, but what exactly? And this work does not make that clear either. So he proceeds in Heideggerian fashion from the premise that, quote, and I'm not going to do too much Heideggerian quoting here, quote, "The question concerning the meaning of being of the historical must be posed in relation to the most advanced investigation of historicity, i.e. Dilthey." Okay. And Marcuse is also trying to argue with Heidegger, who is particularly critical of Hegel's phrase, "spirit falls into time," because spirit, says Heidegger, is already in time, because life is through and through temporal. Now let's pause here for a second, and just very briefly, I'll try to explain here to the best of my ability what I think he's doing. Life, and by this Hegel means not only living things, but the movement of the cycle of life. The cycle of life through which the planet, the animal life, and the cycles through which nature moves, right? Life for Hegel is the first exemplification of the concept. Why? Because life is that form of being which can only exist by differentiating itself from itself. Life is the first form of being in which you have the unity of non-unity and unity. It is a form of actuality of the existent through differentiation and the of identity and difference. Now, you have to understand that for Hegel, there is an ontological scale. Human consciousness, human beings are both alive and conscious and self-conscious. But human beings are continuous in that sense, right? And emergent from the phenomenon of life. An aspect of Hegel that is not usually emphasized, and Hegel is taken to be a dualist. He's not a dualist, he's a monist. Life, consciousness emerges out of life. Life and consciousness are continuous, and of course, consciousness and self-consciousness are ontologically a different principle. And Hegel is not reluctant to say a higher principle than life, although emerging out of life. Okay, what does all have to do with historical materialism? Why is Marcusa now reading this? You might say he is trying to show, to Dilthey and Heidegger, the strength of Hegel's concept of life. But it is in the second half of Hegel's ontology that Marcusa's intentions become clear with his transition to the domain of the social. If you look at the book, it begins with an analysis of the logic and moves to the phenomenology. I know we don't have to go that much into the intertextual details of Marcusa's intentions, but Marcusa's goal is finally to show that life, that objective spirit, okay? Objective spirit is a higher form of life and therefore also a higher form of the concept. Life now discloses itself in the form of social being, in the form of social being. And I want to quote a passage to you, which is quite astonishing in the midst of a text on ontology, because it comes from Hegel's early writings, and it says something about what Marcusa is up to. Okay? 28 of the translator's introduction. I mean, what I'm claiming here myself is that Marcusa is trying to give us a kind of genetic account of the intersubjective constitution of the social world. And so here he quotes a passage on work. Work is always the work of a specific individual that realizes itself through it. Every individual thereby places in the space of being its own determinate work. For every other individual, however, this is alien and must be sublated through transformative action. It then follows that every individual must defend and prove itself against all others. The work thereby becomes an object of struggle in the reciprocal opposition of individuals. The reality of the individual and its work, which were originally determinate, prove themselves as unreal and vanishing moments. Now, you should justifiably ask yourselves, what on earth is this concept of work and the struggle around the concept of work doing in the midst of life, objective spirit, etc.? This passage goes back to Hegel's early writings in the Jena logic, where Hegel is trying to understand contemporary society, and indeed the concepts of work and the struggle of recognition already have their origin in the Jena writings, and subsequently it is first Habermas in Life and Interaction, and then subsequently Axel Honneth, who will pick up these themes of reciprocal recognition in their own work. But what Marcuse does is, through this very tortured reading, and I agree with you, I had to torture myself to translate this work, that Marcuse establishes now how the most advanced categories of bourgeois philosophy lead to the fundamental categories of historical materialism, labor as the transformation of self and other, of substance and subject, labor as the autogenesis of the human being, as Marx may have said. Having traveled this tortuous path from Heideggerian fundamental ontology through Hegel's logic, and to the point when, in the phenomenology of spirit, its social constitution, the social constitution of objective spirit through work and action and interaction is disclosed. Now, in his second Hegel book, Marcuse's intentions are more explicit, and he directly moves from Hegelian philosophy to social theory. Let us return once more to Carl Schmitt's phrase with which Marcuse ends Reason and Revolution. The day of Hitler's ascent to power, Hegel, so to speak, died. This is because Hegel's 1821 philosophy of right is a vindication of the post-liberal society, the liberal society of the post-1789 period. And let me say something about the translation of this work as philosophy of right or philosophy of law. I prefer philosophy of right because, as is well known in German, the word Recht has both a subjective and objective meaning, but not only that, Hegel is very explicit in the philosophy of right that law is one form in which what is right can be institutionalized. Why? Because what is right is the normative universe. Custom is what's right, right? Talks about it. It's a form of what is right. So the philosophy of right is the philosophy of the state in which modern law that is gazetted, law that is declared, law that is announced from a non-public source becomes part of the architectonic of the state. Very important point, because Hegel is also struggling in this work with historicist analyses of the law that see it as simply emerging out of historical development, and that the validity of the law is its historical genesis. And Hegel is saying, no, the validity of modern law is that it gives expression to the, or it in cases makes possible the freedom of the individual. Yet the state that Hegel defends is neither liberal nor republican. It is a constitutional monarchy with a representative body composed in equal measure of feudal and bourgeois elements. Hegel acknowledges the power of the Prussian landed aristocracy, the Junkers. He does not permit universal manhood suffrage, and instead has corporations, and careful here, corporations mean professional bodies. They don't mean commercial corporations for Hegel. And instead has corporations send representatives from the professional bodies to the parliamentary assembly. This representative body also includes a class which had hitherto been quite absent in modern philosophy, modern political philosophy. This class now makes its appearance in social and political thought, and after this, it is neither to be forgotten nor neglected. I mean, of course, the state bureaucracy. The bureaucracy whose task is, according to Hegel, to translate the particular and competing interest of civil society into the universal, i.e. the good of the whole, and by the bureaucracy, he means basically civil servants of the state, okay? The constitutional monarch, the sovereign, again, very important moment to contrast with Hobbes and other thinkers. The sovereign, he says, must only be entrusted to dot the I. Okay? He trusts the sovereign much less than Justice Robb. Compare the two concepts of the sovereign, right? In my view, the greatness of Hegel's theory of the modern state does not lie, obviously, in this mixture of feudal and bourgeois elements. To that extent, Marx, who devoted an entire critique to Hegel's philosophy of right, is correct. But we know, or we should try to understand, why Hegel makes this compromise. Having celebrated all his life the fall of Bastille on July 14th with a glass of wine, Hegel nonetheless sought to construct the political theory of the post-revolutionary state in such a way that no particular class or group would be able to act in the name of the whole or the universal. Hegel was concerned by the revolutionary instability caused by each competing group in the Assemblée Nationale, the claim that it alone represented or embodied the will of the people alone. These continuing conflicts between the constitutive and constituting assemblies, as they were called, in the succession of governments at the French Revolution, led Hegel to embed the universal in a balancing act among social groups, such that no one really could speak in its name. But what about the bureaucracy, or say? Did they not embody the universal and thus act in the name of the whole? Would they not prove equally dangerous? In Hegel's scheme, at least, this class of civil servants would be loyal to the Constitution alone and would not pretend to have monopoly over its representation. As is well known, it was Max Weber who took up the puzzles of Hegel's theory of bureaucracy in the modern state. Weber developed three ideal forms of legitimacy: traditional, charismatic, and legal rational. The modern state bureaucracy represented legal rational authority. It enabled legal rational authority in the modern state. So let us return to Hegel again. In Herbert Marcuse's famous words, in the philosophy of right, Hegel sought to celebrate the revolution, but condemned the revolutionaries themselves for seeking to represent or to give voice to the universal. The eros of Hegelian political philosophy, if I may speak in those terms, is driven by the reformist and enlightened class of civil servants who tried to modernize the modern Prussian state. but without letting it go off the rails, either towards economic or class conflict. These future bureaucrats attended Hegel's classes en masse, produced some of the best notes and lectures, and subsequently went into Prussian state service, and with many Jewish students among them. And this is an important point that I should also mention, because it was recognized as such. Part of the political drama behind the philosophy of right is also the so-called Karlsbad decree, when the Prussian state outlaws student organizations, the so-called Burschenschaften. Now, you may think that this was an anti-liberal authoritarian move. Some extent it may be, but these Burschenschaften, these student organizations, were deeply nationalistic and deeply anti-Semitic. And Hegel would have nothing to do with them. And in fact, he is very explicit in the philosophy of right about the necessity of granting civil rights to Jewish people. And this is an important moment in Hegel's understanding of liberalism, along with his understanding of the Quakers and the Anabaptists. He thinks that the state should not force them into performing military service. So these are sort of small details and jewels that are just scattered here and there. So neither the reactionary conservatism of the Heritage Foundation nor the revolutionary reaction of National Socialism can embody the spirit of Hegel's concept of the state. For Hegel, the state cannot be the possession of a party, of a movement, or of a Führer. Neither can the modern state instill virtue in its citizens as the ancient Greeks and Romans did. The young Hegel lamented the passing away of the polis, but celebrated the spirit of freedom of modern times, and celebrated that this would give rise to a more differentiated and complex understanding of civic virtue and belonging. Hegel's ideal of ethical life is not communitarian, and here I differ from many readings of Hegel's philosophy of right, because this ethical life encompasses conflict, individualism, as well as competition within it. Individuals seeking their own ideals of the good can come into conflict with others' projects, who can thwart them as well as misunderstand them. Consumers and property owners who compete within the modern system of needs, okay, System der Bedürfnisse, which is really the commodity marketplace, realize that the modern economy, which creates such luxury, is nonetheless not wealthy enough to prevent the emergence of the rabble, a class of underemployed and unemployed individuals. And in one of the most sort of passages of the philosophy of right with sort of enormous foresight, Hegel writes, it hence becomes apparent that despite an excess of wealth, civil society is not rich enough, i.e. its own resources are insufficient to check excessive poverty and the creation of a penurious rabble, okay? So the creation of poverty for Hegel is a consequence of the system of needs. Now, Hegel read a lot of British political economy in the Jena period. And he was quite aware also of the discussions around the so-called English Reform Bill and how to deal with poverty. So these passages are not just sort of drops here and there. And also in a famous addition to paragraph 248, he already says, civil society is thus driven to found colonies. Increase of population alone has this effect, but it is due in particular to the appearance of a number of people who cannot secure the satisfaction of their needs by their own labor once production rises above the requirements of consumers. Again, civil society does not seem able to find a solution to its own problem of poverty. Hegel does not really know about why wages are determined at a certain level. He just is phenomenologically picking up on these, but he knows that this is part of the dilemma of modern civil society. And what he says here about colonialism is also interesting. He distinguishes between Germans who just pick up and go to America or Russia, and on the other hand, the self-conscious efforts by the German government to settle certain lands, right? So there are those who leave as opposed to the colonists that the government sponsored. So modern civil society engages then in overseas markets, both to dump its goods as well as its surplus population. This is here, I disagree once more with Marcusa. Whereas he, like the young Marx, calls attention to the conciliatory elements of Hegel's theory of the state, I marvel at Hegel's proto-Marxist account of the contradictions of bourgeois civil society and the sense of tragedy in his efforts to situate modern freedom within such a conflictual social structure. Freedom as autonomy is not obeying the universal law, and as our colleague Axel Honneth notes in his book Friedensrecht, das Recht der Freiheit, it is about finding institutional forms which contain individual search for competing conceptions of the good within a differentiated social whole. A liberal society is a scheme both for competition and cooperation. Hegel's philosophy, coming to slowly to an end, Hegel's philosophy, and in particular the philosophy of right, brings modern philosophy to the point where the classical goals of normative political philosophy, i.e. the search for the good and the just, the to kalon, must now lead to an analysis of liberal society and its transformation. The tradition of political philosophy thus becomes social theory. Theorists of the Frankfurt School would then argue that the liberal society, which at one point had nourished the autonomous individual and which Hegel tried to capture in his philosophy of the state, had disappeared in the period between the two world wars. The free market of goods, labor, and exchange had given rise to a form of organized monopoly capitalism. The authority of the father in the nuclear family would be transformed and give rise to the authoritarian personality who was loyal to the movement and the party. Parliament would become the battleground between class interests. After the devastation of the First World War, German war debt, and the Great Depression, no state bureaucracy could contain or manipulate class conflict. The Weimar Republic was the last Hegelian attempt to base the legitimacy of the modern state on the rule of law and a democratic constitution. And as Carl Schmitt well knew, this legacy came to an end with Hitler's rise to power. So let me end on a personal note. I completed my PhD thesis on Hegel's philosophy of right at Yale University in 1977. The dissertation was called Natural Right and Hegel, an essay in modern political philosophy. My goal was to vindicate the legacy of modern political philosophy against Leo Strauss's charges of nihilism and historicism. Remember Leo Strauss's book, Natural Right and History. I read Hegel as a critic of the social contract tradition, but as one who nevertheless accepted freedom of the individual as a legitimating ground of the modern state. I tried to show how for Hegel abstract right, those opening arguments of the philosophy of right were not a justification of possessive individualism, in the words of a famous C.V. Macpherson. Those of my generation will know his famous book, but that these opening arguments on abstract right needed to be understood against the background of commodity relations in modern society, in which property, Eigentum, could only be acquired through contractual exchange, be it through wage relations or otherwise. I argued that precisely because Hegel knew what contract and property meant in a commodity market economy, he would not base the state on an act of original contract. He said contract is just for the exchange of commodities, not the origins of relations of right. The modern state, in his view, came about in history. The task of philosophy was to comprehend its rationality. Let me end by saying that all institutions of modernity, property, contract, ethical life, family, system of needs, etc., contain normativity as well as facticity, Habermas' words. The philosophy of right is Hegel's account of how such normativity and facticity clash and propel the modern state beyond its own boundaries. The final section of the philosophy of right on world history may be read as a species of Hobbesian realism, the way Marcusa does, in fact. It leads to Hegel's most speculative and dialectically unrigorous reflections on Hegel, on world history, and such absurd phrases as Die Weltgeschichte ist das Weltgericht, world history is also the judge of the world, emerge at this point in Hegel's philosophy of history. And this is the point at which I left Hegel's philosophy of right for Kantian cosmopolitanism.
Thank you, Seyla, for that brilliant presentation paper, which we hopefully will be able to publish on the website so everyone can go over it. It's hot off the press, so. I thought I'd make some comments and ask a few questions. I think I want to start though by clarifying the notion of living in Hegelian times. And the idea there is not so much that we're living in at where one would arrive at the end of the philosophy of right, but that we are at a juncture historically where it feels as if there is a radical, significant shift in the American spirit, and perhaps European spirit as well, perhaps global spirit, I'm not sure, but certainly of the American spirit. And that we are somehow at a point where it feels as if the American spirit is going in a negative or dialectical way against everything that the country stood for, the administrative state, the constitution, the existing norms. So that we're at the threshold of a historical shift right now, kind of a paradigm shift that is pushing us in a new era from perhaps the bureaucratic, economistic, cost-benefit, regulatory form of government that we were so familiar with in the modern period, through the Clinton period, through the Obama period, a bureaucratic vision of American society that perhaps is represented by I would use as the symbol the OIRA, right? The Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at the OMB, right? This age of the Obama age was, the Cass Sunstein was leading OIRA. All regulations were going through there. Everything was going through a cost-benefit analysis, and it was just this regulatory state at its, apex, right? And it seems as if we're fundamentally changing towards some form of arbitrary, leader-oriented, patrimonialist, the other forms of Weber's authority, sultanism. I mean, there are so many different ways to explain this. It's patron-client, there are kin ties. It's, Jared Kushner is our, negotiator on everything. It's just, Musk is doing Doge. It's just the radical opposite of this, well-oiled regulatory state. And that there's almost, it feels like a dialectical dimension to this. And these notions that Marcuse develops of negation and negativity seem to be at play, and I'll be coming back to those notions. And that there is something of an American spirit associated with the MAGA movement or something that is starting to make its presence known. And that of course, is very different than Hegelian times in the sense of 1820 Prussian bureaucracy. It's radically different. But it's that idea that somehow we are undergoing a shift and that we have to think about it in a historical way, that perhaps one need not embrace all of Hegel's philosophy of history, but that there's something going on at that level. And that's the idea of kind of Hegelian times. Now, the big question then, of course, is how one would read Hegel within that dialectic, right? And I entirely agree with you, Seyla, that there is, of course, one reading, and an important reading of Hegel as a revolutionary thinker, a thinker of the revolution. And this is, of course, the importance of the element of freedom in the philosophy of right. The philosophy of right as itself being an articulation of free will coming into existence and transforming over time into sovereignty, right? Achieving a full sense of freedom in the organized civil society and state. And to a certain extent, that is, of course, Marcuse's reading, right? I mean, that's why revolution is in the title of the book. But I mean, you see it well if you look at pages, 326, for instance, right? Where he writes that German political leaders clearly recognized that Hegel's philosophy, far from justifying the state in the concrete shape it had taken, rather contained an instrument for its destruction. Right? This was the idea in which Hegel was the revolutionary. On page 325, on the bottom of 325, the page before, the Hegelian dialectic was seen as the prototype of all destructive negations of the given, for in it, every immediately given form passes into its opposite and attains its true content only by doing so. This kind of philosophy, the critic said, denies to the given the dignity of the real. It contains the principle of revolution, Stahl said, right? So there's no question that is one way in which we can think of Hegel in this moment, and in terms of that dialectic that emphasizes, of course, the phenomenology of spirit, certain passages from the philosophy of right. But I think it's also fair to agree with other readings of Hegel, an Althusserian reading of Hegel, for instance, that the 1820 book needs to be severed because there are passages in there, and you can think of the passages. I think it's in section 279, the one that Marx picks up on about the way in which the idea of the people, right? The critique of this idea of the people that he has, which of course Marx rejects and pushes in a democratic direction. But there are these passages that can be read from a different perspective and that lead to this more reactionary Hegel, the Hegel of hereditary constitutional monarchy. And of course, you hear that in Marcuse as well. So actually, and you were referring to one of Hegel's last works, which was his essay on the English Reform Bill, right? And you have Marcusa on page 248 critiquing Hegel specifically for being reactionary, non-revolutionary, right? And he quotes this passage from Hegel on 248. At the end of that passage, you clearly hear Hegel saying, no, this reform bill is not a good idea. It might bring forth a revolution, right? And those are Hegel's last words in that passage, a reform, it would bring forth a revolution. So I think that, both of these readings are there in Marcuse's reading of Hegel, but also in our general reception of Hegel. And I think that we need to hold on to both of those as we try to make sense of all of this. And in part, right, in large part, that's one of the reasons why this is not a seminar on Hegel, but a seminar on interpretations of Hegel, right? Particularly a seminar on inversions of Hegel, what people did to Hegel. Because there are those competing passages in there, and then from my perspective, or in terms of what this seminar is about, it's like seeing what people did with those different pieces of Hegel. And it's in that context that I think the Heritage Foundation becomes interesting, again, to see kind of how they might be possibly building off and also differentiating themselves. And so the claim wouldn't necessarily be that the Heritage Foundation is a correct reflection of Hegelian thought, by no means, right? But how they too are playing off of the pieces of the Hegelian system. The pieces of the Hegelian system, which is so fundamental to their structure of argument. If you look at the leadership for the mandate for leadership, which is built on family, civil society, and the state. And that's the way they present everything. Those are their three kind of pillars: restoring the family, creating community, which they call civil society, meaning that it needs to be the church and schools and PTAs that are the mediating agencies for civil society. And then their view of the state, which also is very different, and very different than Hegel, because they're actually at least they present in the leadership, in the mandate for leadership, as being opposed to presidential power, in favor of people power. It's fascinating. They present as actually being only in favor of congressional power and legislation. Now that's kind of striking and stunning. Given that we've got right now the most unified and imperial presidency that we've ever had, and that they seem supportive of it. But in any event, that's what makes the Heritage Foundation here interesting. And again, to try and understand it through the lens of Hegel, without saying that they are Hegelian, but picking up on the pieces. Now that brings me first then back to Marcuse, and then second back to Seyla Benhabib. So let me start with Marcuse. There is no doubt in my mind that Marcuse was trying to show that Hegel was anti-fascist. And in that, I agree entirely with you. He is, in this text, recuperating Hegel from the fascists. He is recuperating them predominantly from the Italian fascists who had appropriated Hegel, Gentile. But he's also trying to show that National Socialism is anti-Hegelian. And in this sense, it's a very interesting enterprise in the sense that it is so similar to the way in which others in a similar period, 36, 39, were trying to recuperate Nietzsche from the fascists as well, right? And so you can think here of, it was Georges Bataille and Jean Val and André Masson, the artist, and their whole enterprise, the acéphale, was to recuperate Nietzsche from the fascists. And here, there's no doubt that Marcuse is trying to recuperate Nietzsche from the fascists. It's what motivates his whole book. And you hear it so loudly in those passages on page 418, 419, right? The ideological roots of authoritarianism have their soil in the violent reaction against Hegel that styled itself the positive philosophy. At the bottom, the social and political theory responsible for the development of fascist Germany was related to Hegelianism in a completely negative way. It was anti-Hegelian in all its aims and principles, right? And so that is, one of the main missions of the text. And in that way, at least Marcuse's reading of Hegel clearly is the anti-fascist reading. An anti-fascist reading that highlights or operates through the concept of negation, negativity, the negative moment of the dialectic. And so, on my reading, the Reason and Revolution, what's going on is Hegel is trying to draw two genealogies. One that goes from Hegel's philosophy to negation, to critical theory and immanent critique, and the other one that goes from positive philosophy, as he calls it, to positivism, and this is Auguste Comte for him. It's Schelling is part of this for him. George Ernst Stahl is part of this, to the positivism, to fascism. And on that thread is a kind of linear genealogy that goes from positive philosophy to positivism to fascism. And again, actually in the passage that I just read there from page 418, you hear it well, right? It's the ideological roots of authoritarianism have their soil in the reaction against Hegel that styled itself the positive philosophy. And of course, most of the second part of the book is about tracing this positive philosophy and then positivism in the social sciences. So I take it that that is the work then that he's doing with Hegel. It's drawing on the notion of negation, negativity, on Marcuse's reading. That is kind of what he does with Hegel, is to extract that concept. And that then, I would say, so that would be kind of, in a way, my proposal as to kind of what Marcuse is doing with Hegel. It's kind of like extracting the negativity of that moment in order to then, right, motivate his work, shapes his critical theory, shapes his praxis. Negation becomes then later the great refusal, right? The term that is so associated with Marcuse. And you feel that great refusal and you feel that negativity, which is also, of course, something that Adorno is working with in his negative dialectics in a different way, but you feel it in the preface. You feel it even come out more in the preface from 1960 that he adds on, which is called A Note on Dialectic, right? And it's in that note on dialectic, actually, that it almost, this is the direction in which it takes him. It does have a different tone and a different flavor than the rest of the book. I agree. He is more critical of Hegel and reason in this preface than he is in the whole book. And in part, perhaps, it has something to do with the changing times. 1960, colonial wars are going on. It's a different time than 1941 when he's writing the book. And of course, this turns into the critique of consumerism, the critique of capitalism that runs through the later work and through the one-dimensional man. And you mentioned this, of course, when you were mentioning the other essays, Counter-Revolution and Revolt, and the essay on liberation, as you were saying, it was giving voice to the critiques of consumerism and capitalism, desire of younger generations, you were saying, to drop off and turn off. That in a way, I would argue, kind of in response to the second question, that's where Marcuse's work on Hegel takes him ultimately. The question then would be, of course, what do we do with that in today's context? Okay. In today's context, when it feels as if, in a strange way, the power of negativity has been appropriated or seized by the reactionaries and the far right. It feels as if the great refusal is more Steve Bannon today than it is the left. The radical critique of the system. There's a way in which Trump's rise to power and the anti-establishment foundations of that rise to power are more a reflection of the power of negativity than anything that the left was doing recently, at least. And so one question would be, how do we tap into that power of negative thinking, right? In part, this raises questions about notions of utopia, which was a part of your work originally, Critique Norm Utopia. What happened to utopia on the left? Or, I've been working a lot with concepts of concrete utopias now, but still, what happened to notions of utopia on the left? How is that related to this power of negative thinking, right, that is so important for Marcuse? And did the left possibly go too far in evacuating questions of utopia? Did Marcuse go too far in evacuating it or in pushing radical negativity? Do we need positive thinking now, right? Or does that lead to fascism, which was Marcuse's point, right? Do we need to flip this now? Do we need to do another inversion, as it were, of Marcuse on Hegel? So that's I'll try and consolidate these questions at the end, but I think that's one large question here in terms of our reading of Marcuse and what we would do with him today. Now, let me go to our reading of Seyla Benhabib and what we would do with that today. So I take it that you're doing a few things with Hegel, and it's interesting to put them together. On the one hand, you are recuperating a notion of freedom and subjectivity, and you're recuperating his political economy, and the way in which it was a precursor to Marxian thought. And you are committed to that. You are committed to the emancipatory potential of Hegelian philosophy. And you also say that you marvel at Hegel's proto-Marxist account of the contradictions of bourgeois civil society. So there are parts of Hegel that you are kind of recuperating. But at the same time, you're telling us that you also left Hegel for Kant, right? So you indicate that it's at this point in the philosophy of right that you left Hegel for Kant's cosmopolitanism, although at the same time you say you never left Hegel totally behind, right? Okay. And then a third move you're making on Hegel is to argue, and this is arguing with Marcuse and agreeing with Marcuse, right, that you followed the path that led philosophy to a critical theory of society. And of course, this is what Marcuse says, especially in the short essay that we also had for today, which is in Negations in the Philosophy and Critical Theory, a short little text that Marcuse wrote later on, which is published in 1968. I'm not sure when this essay was written exactly, but it would have been a few years before. Once critical theory, Marcuse writes, once critical theory had recognized the responsibility of economic conditions for the totality of the established world and comprehended the social framework in which reality was organized, philosophy became superfluous as an independent scientific discipline dealing with the structure of reality. And that you, in a way, endorse, I think. At least you endorse the move from philosophy to critical theory. So there is both this way in which you're recuperating some Hegel, but moving to Kant's cosmopolitanism, while also embracing the move to critical theory. So the question would be, what are you doing to Hegel? What work are you doing on Hegel, recuperating him, but also leaving him behind, but not? And I think that the answer is that there is something in Hegel that led you forward, or backwards in a way, to Kant. And so the question would be, what was that? Why? How does the cosmopolitanism clash or contradict your reading of Hegel? And then, of course, the third question in our series of questions, what you did with Hegel, where it led you, and what we might take of it today. What could we learn from what you operate on Hegel for our own present? And here's a proposal. It would be that somehow cosmopolitanism is the utopian or concrete utopian vision that is positive and not pure negation. It might depend on negativity and immanent critique and critical theory, but it is then ultimately a positive vision that you're presenting for us. And I wonder what you think of that. So let me just recap my three questions to you. The first would be, what do you think of this reading of Marcuse that emphasizes kind of the power of negativity as being the work that he does on Hegel that then influences his praxis? The second question would be, am I right that then the cosmopolitanism, your cosmopolitanism, is somehow what the work that you did on Hegel leads you to as then a positive, or having a dimension of a positive philosophy? And then third, if that's right, is it time then for a positive and not just the great refusal in this moment, in this historical moment? So those would be the three questions that I would ask you to maybe elaborate on. But then I'll also finish on a personal note, because this was very moving for me to do this reading with you and think with you, because I had actually started with Hegel when I was working with Sheldon Wallen as an undergraduate and was writing my senior thesis with him. So it was going to be on Hegel's Lord Bondsman dialectic and its influence on Sartre, and that's what I worked in. So I too kind of started with Hegel, and but when I came to work with you and do my PhD with you, Seyla, I turned from Hegel to Foucault and became somewhat obsessed with questions of knowledge power. And so that was a bit of my trajectory, and it feels, and of course, led me on a very different path, and spending too many years, among other things, editing Foucault's work, mostly on knowledge power period in the 1970s, and but almost making a full circle then back at this evening, back to the Hegel. And you know, when you say you went with Kant's cosmopolitanism, you know, I kind of feel as if none of these thinkers are up to these times. And so I can't say I'm embracing any one of them, but seeking instead to see kind of how thinkers confronted them, to see if there's anything if there's any way that we can be up to these times. So let me turn it back to you, Seyla.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me just say something about the power of negativity. That's a very illuminating comment, Bernard. I understand the power of negativity in Marcusa, not just in terms of refusal and resistance, but negativity has something to do with the attitude also of seeking to, of understanding how what is comes to be. And there is a strange use of the concept of positivity in Hegel's early writings, right? The positivity of the Christian religion. And put an ordinary American reader, what on earth does he mean by the positivity of the Christian religion? And positivity means, for Hegel, what is given, Gesetz. And this word, Setzung, Satz, Gesetz, these are treacherous sort of shows where you can play with the German language there. And so by the positivity of the Christian religion, which will help us understand Marcusa's negativity, what Hegel meant simply that institutions are there, but they are hollowed out. They are meaningless. This was his early critique of the church. And we know he himself ended up in, so sort of in a pietistic understanding of this community of equals. I think you point this out somewhere. Now, if that is what positivity is, negativity then is the attitude that, or the power of thought that tries to comprehend why what is has come to be what it is. Because there, I think you can understand Marcusa's critique of Auguste Comte. Why would poor Auguste Comte be dragged into all this, right? And I think that it's because for Marcusa, negativity, just also for Horkheimer in that traditional and critical theory essay, means basically understanding the historicity of what is. So for me, the concepts of negativity and historicity and understanding the coming to be of what is are closely related. And in fact, in traditional and critical theory, what is traditional theory? Traditional theory is theory that accepts the facts as they are and also does not reflect on the role of the knower in the constitution of the facts. So I think that is the link that I am making between the power of negativity. Certainly it has something to do with the subjective attitude that you're talking as well. But I think it's best to trace the lineage of negativity over positivity to the facts, to historicity, and thus see the connection between traditional and critical theory that Marcuse is establishing. And I was thinking, in a world where we now have to almost be jealous that facts remain facts, right? Remember Angela Merkel's said it was that we live in a post-fact universe, right? I mean, we are sort of caught in a world of images, and we can't be as contemptuous maybe as they were, about the given, the factual. So there's some further reflection that we need to do about where we are today. And I'm not sure that I would put Auguste Comte with the fascists. I wouldn't. I mean, he's a positivist sociologist. He's not, unless there are some things in his political thought I don't know. But enough. So that's another. But I think you want to, hear more about cosmopolitanism. Certainly, cosmopolitanism not only sounds like a concrete utopia, it just sounds like Spinnerei, what the Germans call, you must be, just like sort of going off the deep end, we would say. What cosmopolitanism, right? I mean, but we have to understand the principles behind it. Clearly, our world is in a regressive, or much of our world is in a moment of regressive ethno-nationalism. And cosmopolitanism seems to be like weak tea to offer to these gentlemen in particular, or some gentlewomen at this point in time. I mean, look at all the negative Amazons running around in Department of Homeland Security and so on. Anyways, that's another topic. So, what did Kant signify there? Well, it is the disappearance of the philosophy of history, right? That, and this is what I think you sense in Marcusa's later preface to Reason and Revolution. It's not only that you cannot write, a poetry after Auschwitz, as Adorno said. It's just that it's obscene to look at human history simply as in terms of a teleological account, even if it be just like sort of what Fukuyama tried to do, the end of history. That just doesn't work. Now, you might say, didn't Kant think that there was a philosophy of history as well? And that's a difficult discussion. But what I find that Kant opens and that you cannot get with Hegel is, first of all, the emergence of the idea of some kind of unity of humankind. Okay, the unity of humankind that can transform itself into a form of what? Governmentality, republicanism, federalism, right? I mean, Kant himself had his ethnocentric fallacies. We all know the huge discussion about content racism that has gone on in recent years. So we can't quite say that Kant was a universalist in that sense. But there is this belief, or there is this principle of the unity of humankind that can be established through the creation of forms of government that are adequate to human freedom and human equality. And it's his dream that Republican governments confederated will lead to some form of perpetual peace, about which he is also cynical and ironical. But perpetual peace simply means that the powers of war and peace will not remain with individual states, but will be embedded in this confederation, in this unity of agreement that the state is a part of. Hegel will have none of that. I mean, since his early writings, he has this, I would say, account of war. Sometimes he calls war a cleansing of the spirit. Now, he's not a fascist, he's not a nationalist. Where is this coming from? I think it is coming from his musings about the Romans, about Machiavelli, that you have to engage in the ultimate sacrifice in order to negate bourgeois society, right? I think that's where Hegel is at, and that's not what I could accept. So when we say cosmopolitanism, therefore, we have to be very careful about what we're talking about, in the sense that it's not a kind of, beady-eyed, well, we're all in this together, kumbaya, there is no conflict, there is no economic competition, there is no different regimes, but it's a principle, it's a regulative principle. And of course, for my purposes, what Kant's work on cosmopolitanism did, it opened up philosophy beyond the border, right? His third principle, look at hospitality as that the right of the stranger to be protected when he or she comes upon your territory. And what does that mean? You know, how does that open up all the questions of asylum and migration, the right of asylum, all the issues that I've been writing about for the last 10 years? Kant opens the door. You know, he opens that door, and at least for me as well. So I think that you are right, Bernard, and I completely agree with you that these are strange times, and more than that, I mean, very disturbing times. I mean, my own background also in Turkey. Look at Erdogan. He came. He's now there. What is it? He's 26th year or whatever. Just imagine. Just imagine. Okay? I mean, we are still thinking that midterm elections will bring the reversal, and inshallah they will. But, just imagine. So in that sense, I agree with you. One last point. There is revolutionary dictum in fascism, and I think people like Steve Bannon are very, very aware of this. I mean, many of the fascists, certainly the Italian fascists who got together with him, understood themselves to be revolutionaries, understood themselves to be completely anti-bourgeois. At the end, they found their peace with capitalism and their financial sponsors. But that element is also there, and it shouldn't surprise us when you find them also parroting some of the words of the left, not at all. And of course, we know that there were many people who probably were active in the drafting of that statement in the Heritage Foundation that come. There are political philosophers.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. In fact, I mean, there's no doubt that, Andreas, you've written about this too. There's no doubt that there's this kind of revolutionary element in the language of the far right that has appropriated, in a sense, the radicality that belonged to the left and needs to be addressed because it's not clear that the response can simply be forms of restoration to some glorious past. And in that sense, you know, that's another way in which kind of the Hegelian way of thinking about history can be helpful, right? In other words, like this, you know, there isn't a way to go back to restore some glorious liberal past at this point. And therefore, we need to be thinking about how negation works and pushes us forward more radically. Just one last thing before I open it up, and I know folks want to jump in, so start raising your hands. Just on the positivism thing, I just want to emphasize something because I think this is important for our students in a way. So the claim, I take it the claim is not that Auguste Comte was fascist or anything like that. It's that there is something in the mindset of the positivist, something in the mindset of the positivist researcher, right, that paradoxically ends up normatively justifying the status quo.
Yes.
And that's the point, right? And that's the dangerous point. It's the conservatism that is paradoxically in positivism. And I think that that's what he was saying when he was saying that positivism leads to fascism. Is that it leads to a kind of complete justifying of the status quo, non-critical attitude towards the present, non-normative attitude towards the present. And that's why all you students should not be doing positivist social science, right? Okay? Because it has that paradoxical normative effect of just justifying what you are studying, right? And doesn't allow you to kind of take that distance that, you know, the power of negative thinking provides for. Okay, so let's open it up because I'm sure that you're dying to ask some questions. Yes, Aaron, why don't you kick us off and why don't you take that mic? Pass the mic down, Usma. Push the thing towards you, towards the top, yeah.
There we go.
Yes,
okay.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benhabib, for your presentation. I wondered if I might first just quarrel a bit with something you said, Professor Harcourt, about the English Reform Bill and Hegel, and then I wanted to ask a question about Marcuse as anti-fascist, which I think gets to kind of the heart of the discussion that has been raised thus far. Marcuse doesn't actually say that Hegel is reactionary, right? He agrees with Rudolf Heim that Hegel isn't opposing the Reform Bill out of a reactionary political philosophy. Hegel did not disapprove the tendency and content of the Reform Bill, but feared the danger of reforms as such. So Hegel's belief in the stability of the Restoration state was shaken, right? And I think he says later that He lost faith or confidence that the existing form of the state would endure, and so his philosophy ends in doubt and resignation. And I think we should remember what, the kind of precursors to Marx and Engels thought of the Reform Bill, which was that it was the realization of middle-class democracy, and it actually enabled, right, a class or a faction to use the state against society, right? The famous building of what the workers used to call the bastilles, the poorhouses, and the workhouses that were overseen by the new Reform Parliament, and that the Reform Bill really was never supported by most of the working class movement at the time, and really the leader of Francis Place was in some ways kind of the first middle class demagogue. So I do think part of what Marcuse is getting at here is that I think he says something like, Hegel knew that the dynamics inherent in civil society, once loosened from the protective mechanisms of the state, could at any moment release forces to shake the whole system. Arguably that happened because of the Reform Bill. And that Hegel somehow doesn't have confidence in the possibilities for freedom in and through the state. In the world as he sees it changing at the end of his life. And I think this opens up the question of Marxism and proletarian socialism as an inheritor of Hegel. And maybe this gets to the anti-fascism question, because I found myself wanting in some ways to challenge the idea that Marcuse is being anti-fascist or saying that Hegel's anti-fascist, or at least it means we have to ask what we mean by anti-fascism, right? Because, first of all, saying that fascism is anti-Hegelian means, of course, that it's the antithesis of Hegel, which means in a way it comes from Hegel, right? I feel like part of the point that Marcuse is trying to make throughout the book is that, the real inheritor of the problem of freedom raised by Hegel is Marxism, right? And sort of the deep illiberalism and anti-Hegelianism of positivism, right? And then later of fascism in a kind of much sharper way politically, right? Is the result of, the failure actually, the liquidation in the case of fascism, the literal liquidation of proletarian socialism, right? Politically, as well as ideologically. But that if one is not going to take up Marxism, actually one can't save Hegel. And I think this is really important writing in 1941, because there is, of course, a liberal anti-fascism, right, which is not Marxist. And then there's the official Marxist anti-fascism, which is the Popular Front of the official communist parties, of which Marcuse was, in fact, kind of intensely critical. So if we think about Marcuse today, is the left supposed to be anti-fascist today? And what would it mean if the left is anti-fascist? Today at the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, right, in what Hegel called the land of the future, that's what America is, right? It's the future of the bourgeois revolution is here. And at the head of the American Revolution today stands not the left, not Marxism, not a proletarian socialist, movement, but instead Donald Trump. And is the left in being anti-fascist, therefore, to make itself anti-American and anti-bourgeois revolutionary, anti-Hegelian? Is it to make itself the last defenders of the status quo, right? That's a real problem. And is it to make itself in a funny way? If we want to think about cosmopolitanism, what's the basis materially for cosmopolitanism today in the world that we could point to? It's the working class of the United States of America, which is more cosmopolitan than probably any group or population on Earth, i.e. having, not just accidental, but, people who come from every single nation as a part of it. So I think, I hope that just maybe pushes what I feel like is the depth of the problem that's being raised here. And in that context, okay, what does it mean for Marcuse to be anti-fascist or to be related to some sort of politics of anti-fascism? Is that at least problematic, or should we question what that means? Thank you.
Seyla, do you want to?
No, I wouldn't listen to what you have to say. I don't know Erin, so I have to understand. But
Well, I'll just make a few kind of comments. So, first of all, it's interesting. It's interesting when you're talking about Hegel and America as the future. That there's actually, that Marcuse actually has this little passage at the end of the original preface, and it was surprising, right? Where actually Marcuse, in a way, talks about the American nation in that way, and says at the bottom of the original preface, knowing far better than his critics the forces that threaten freedom and reason, and recognizing the forces that have been bound up with the social system Europe had acquired, he once looked beyond that continent to this as the only land of the future, right? And, as the last word of the preface there, I mean, it's kind of interesting. Of course, he is in the United States in 1941. Thank God he is, right? For his own life. And so I think that context has to be read into that passage. And this idea that the United States of 1941, I wouldn't be here otherwise, 1940, was a different America in a way, and represented something different, and had all of that tied into it in terms of the war at the time. Another thing I wanted to say about your position is you're entirely right that what Marcuse is trying to do is to argue that Hegel leads to Marxian social theory, right? There's no question about that. That's the genealogy that he's tracing. And he wants to refute other genealogies. He wants to refute other stories. He wants to refute the story, he explicitly does, that, there were right Hegelians and left Hegelians, and then there was, Bruno Bauer and Feuerbach and whatnot. And no, he says, no. Those folks weren't even Hegelian, right? They didn't understand. The only kind of continuity was Marx and Marxian social thought. And so I agree totally with that reading. I think that's in here pretty very, very clearly. Now, and then the third thing is that, I still do feel that when he talks about Hegel's philosophy ending in doubt and resignation in that passage about the Bill of Rights, that English Reform Bill, that he is taking that up, I sense, to criticize Hegel. That's where he ends with the Hegel. He's kind of like, look, in 1831, when he, at the end of his life, he is not a revolutionary by any stretch of the imagination, but much more conservative. So those are 3 points in reaction to what you said. Now, in terms of the larger provocation, I don't know, we can open it up to other people's thoughts, or maybe, go ahead.
I will come back, at first. What you were saying about the English Reform Bill and Hegel's reaction to it and so on is, I think, completely correct. I was looking for the passage in Hegel's Philosophy of Right where he basically addresses the question, so, okay, civil society creates this, he calls it pöbel, this rabble, whatever, and these are the unemployed, what should we do about it? He says, well, if what's offered as public support, this is not dignified, because what we need is work. I think of all the debates, about welfare and work, and, he is, in that sense, I don't know if we would call him a conservative Clintonian or whatever, work instead of welfare, but for him, work is the principle of civil society, and the poor must have their dignity, right? So he's consistent, I think, in that respect. The political issues, look, they're very, very difficult because, I mean, the Frankfurt School, and I'm saying this for many of them, they were not party people. They did have a political practice during the war, and I don't know if you wanted to bring this up or not, but it's always been something of a sore point with the left. Marcusa and Neumann were working in the Office of Strategic Services down in Washington with the CIA. What they were doing is they were translating German texts about property and other issues. And there is a very good book that just contains now all their work and all translations. But when this became known, I remember being in the midst of a lot of discussions where this was taken. You see what the Frankfurt School was about. I think that's garbage, right? They were helping the war effort in their own way. You know, you may, and I think at that point there was really no other way but, you know, to help defeat Hitler. The rest, you know, we could discuss. But the political praxis of the Frankfurt School has always been something of an issue of discussion, a matter of discussion. Were they really part of the Popular Front? No.
But I think we need to make some distinctions within the Frankfurt School too, right? I mean, because of all of the Frankfurt School members, Marcuse was the one who was, I mean, and if you look at the exchanges in '68 with Adorno and Marcuse, you know, I mean, he was much more favorable to the student uprisings, revolution.
He was for the New Left. He represented unorthodox Marxism. Oh, you know, he was for the New Left. He defended the New Left. So, but that doesn't, I mean, I was just using the term Popular Front in terms of those, you know, who were either in the American Communist Party or not, but considered themselves fellow travelers. So in that sense.
Yeah, hey, you want to just pass the mic down?
This is good. Okay. Yeah, I think. Sorry. I think one interesting thing that I've heard recently between current comparisons between the U.S. now and 1930s and 40s Germany, particularly from Americans of color and Black Americans, is to think more to Jim Crow rather than to Nazi Germany, just given the history of America and who's been able to have rights and guarantees from the Constitution. So I think to the point that we're living in Hegelian times, I think I was thinking about that framework. I think that I think in a sense we are, but kind of thinking about the Hegelian dialectic that we talked about from last week. I think it's interesting to think about the U.S. Constitution and the founding of what we consider U.S. democracy, 250 years of democracy, as kind of a positivist principle with these ideas of unalienable rights, of liberty that are supposedly granted to all, but have this fundamental contradiction as outlined by the writers of the Constitution, by Jefferson, by the Founding Fathers, who knew of these contradictions in the same way that they owned enslaved people, and yet at the same time proposed these sort of absolute concepts. And I think, in a sense, I think you can make different arguments of how the administrative state changes in the 30s with the creation of the welfare state, and then again in the 60s with the Great Society. But I think, in that sense, I think the sort of student movements of the 60s and the civil rights movement and everything that Marcusa kind of talks about can sort of act as a negation to the fundamental positive principles of American society, in the sense that it's seeking to, as we discussed, kind of pull back the status quo and offer a new definition of who gets to have rights in true equality, rather than these supposedly absolute principles that only apply to property holding white men. And I think I'm still thinking about this, but I think that the idea that the left went too far, I think I would personally disagree with. I think what we consider as the left being the Obama, Clinton regulatory state, given how involved they were with things like deregulation and in giving power to tech companies in terms of the monopolization. We see how that in and of itself has kind of manifested in the political movements that we see that have led to Trump, and the reason why so many Americans have shifted from someone like Kamala Harris to Donald Trump. I think I've heard many people kind of say that Trump is sort of the epitome of these American principles of this fundamental inequality between different people that's written within our Constitution, that it has always been this kind of fundamental contradiction, and that perhaps we can think of the negation in the 1960s with things like the Civil Rights Act as the reason why Marcusa was the sort of father of the new left. And in thinking about the Hegelian dialectic, this the becoming after the object itself and the negation as sort of returning to the status quo of an America that is fundamentally unequal, which I think is being more clear, or is clear now more than ever. So I think just in that way, in comparing what we've seen with ICE, with Keith Porter and Renee Good and Alex Preddy, I think is very similar to obviously Jim Crow and enslavement and the lynchings that we saw in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So in that sense, I think the arc of American history, in my view, would follow a sort of Hegelian time frame, but I think thinking about where we are right now is almost a return to a status quo rather than a negation, even if the right has co-opted that sort of language.
Thanks. Do you want to say anything? I would just make just a couple of thoughts. So you raised one interesting comparison, which was the relationship between Nazi Germany and our Jim Crow laws. And of course, on that, there has been excellent work by many historians, but James Whitman's book comes to mind of kind of the way in which the Germans were actually turning to some of the miscegenation and other laws in the United States, race laws in the United States as models, etc. Another thing I would, and actually on that, there's a really great exhibit of an artist, John Wilson, at the Metropolitan Museum right now, which really picks up on that, because he was an artist in the working in the 1930s and the 1940s, and he really drew these parallels. His work was all about drawing the parallels between fascism and race in the United States, and it's really taking. So I would recommend that show if you're interested in thinking about that more. And the other thing I would say is simply in terms of the way I was trying to frame it, about the left, I was thinking more about the left. I would be putting Obama and Clinton in some kind of centrist space in terms more of the regulatory state, examples of the regulatory state, neoliberal forms of governing, which then I think that you could work on that the way you were talking about, the way in which those forms of neoliberal governance fed into some of the ways in which the MAGA and the far right have kind of pushed against. But when I was talking about the negation, the loss of utopia, I was thinking more about the left rather than the kind of center left. Yeah, do you want to take that? Do you take the mic? Can you take the mic? And push it up. Just push the thing up. There we go.
Yeah, on that very point, Marcusa surrenders the working class as an agent of social transformation. That he doesn't see, and the New Left didn't see, the working class as an agent of history. Rather, they'd been subsumed. And so I guess one of the questions is, were there other Marxists who took Hegel, and I would argue C.L.R. James did, that there's debate in two ways in the New Left, between a humanist Marxism that continues to believe in working class struggle as being allied with other struggles, with not just a refusal of intellectuals and of marginalized people. And in fact, for C.L.R. James, it's partly the black working class, and that is very much an agent of history and not subsumed. And just one separate point about positivism, you know, George Soros is a student of Karl Popper, who really, you know, is absolutely an opponent of Marcusa and a claim that neither Marx nor Freud is scientific. And that the right, who's their number one enemy but George Soros? So just something to think about.
Okay, thanks.
Tony, could you pass the mic down? I think so.
I was sort of struck, my question is basically, what does ontology have to do with all this? And the theory of historicity. I was struck by the fact that, so in 1964-65, Derrida gave his seminar, which was published a few years back, on Heidegger, the question of history and being, or history and the question of being, which begins very much in the same way that Marcuse's book begins from 1932, which is we need to discuss sort of Seinsgeschichtlichkeit, like the history of being, but at the level of being or ontology. And that's sort of the Heideggerian framework. In the same year, 64-65, Althusser is next door teaching his seminar on reading Capital. And Derrida is very upset that none of the Althusserians come to his seminar, none of the smart ones. Because he says, if you guys want to do Marxism, you first have to understand the ontological determination of all these concepts like society, history. His main opponent is not just Marx, but actually Foucault. So it's very interesting, Bernard, that you moved from, you know, into Foucault, who's basically blamed for being too positivistic or too much of a historian, not enough of a philosopher. So I wonder why, for a moment, Marcuse believed that Hegel needed to provide us with an ontology and a theory of historicity rather than actually doing the critical theory that had to come out of Hegel. Because this is sort of a meta-argument, how Hegel leads to the abandonment or end of philosophy and should produce a critical social theory. But in this very dense book, he's actually not doing that work. He does sort of a Heideggerian spin on we shouldn't be dealing with the historical facts. That's mere historicism. We need a theory of historicity at the level of being, and that's where Hegel comes in. But Heidegger, when he was phrasing this theory in Being and Time, was very much against Hegel's philosophy of history. That was not the right theory. Just like Derrida in 64, 65 will say Marx, including the entire Althusserian school, is also vulgar. It does not ask the fundamental questions. So I see a tension between the philosophical Heideggerian line of thinking or philosophy and the more empirically oriented school of critical social theory. What exactly is the function of ontology in this whole debate? Like, is it trying, I think impossibly, to triangulate between these two to sort of show, hey, we can get, you know, we already knew that Marx got that principle of looking at what is in terms of how it has come into being. We didn't need sort of regurgitation of this in light of a very bombastic sort of theory of historicity. So, you know, it sort of leads us deeper into this rabbit hole rather than out of it. by calling it, a theory of historicity, which could sound a little bit like, let's not get too dirty, let's not do sort of the Foucauldian work, who never called himself, his theory was not called, philosophy of systems of thought, it was a history of systems of thought. And many of the people that sort of come out of the tradition, prefer not to call themselves philosophers. And I think a lot of it has to do with, you basically are flipping the problem. You treat things in terms of ontology rather than treating ontology in terms of ethics and politics. So I had this question about what's the role of ontology and in this triangulation between philosophy, Hegelian philosophy and critical social theory.
So I think that's a great question, and maybe a question to end on in a way, to give your thoughts, your final thoughts, both in response to this question about ontology and then also the whole conversation.
I'm not sure that Marcusa succeeds in this book. I think it is really the effort, if you wish, it's of a brilliant young man to try to push this philosophy that he is very influenced by. And in the article by Robert Pippin that we read basically says, where does Marcusa finally end up? And because there is no analysis of the concept of historicity either. Historicity seems to stand in some vague way for temporality, in some vague way for becoming. And I don't know if you would agree with my critique at the end of the translator's introduction that, I said, it's inconceivable that historicity can be thought of without some form of narrativity. Histoire vécue, there is no distinction in Marcusa's analysis between history as the telling and history as lived history. None of the sort of meta distinctions that we would make about the philosophy of history. So I don't think that he really got there. I think what he got to was some kind of a principle of social becoming. The becoming, that the social is always in the process of its own becoming, and I don't know if that is really enough. And it's it may be one of the reasons also why the book was never really discussed that much, right? There are many Jugendwerke, there are many works of youth that nonetheless do get discussed. This one, it doesn't, so just don't ask me why I wasted 2 years of my life. I wouldn't call it a waste, but I was at times very desperate about being able to complete this translation, but I should have learned my Hegel and Marcuse. But the point that you made also about Foucault and positivism, indeed, but Foucault's methodology is not that of a positivist social scientist. It's such a unique work, but he certainly did empirical work. But some members of the Frankfurt School did as well, right? If we look at theories of the state, Neumann, and if we look at
Militarism and
the
Frankel
theories
and
of
the dual state.
Frankl and the dual state, but also the theory of punishment.
Kirschan.
Right, Kirschan, that's the beginning of sort of in some ways critical legal studies. Now, but this brings me back to the question of Popper, the poverty of historicism. When I was a graduate student, Popper's book made it impossible to even express an interest in Hegel, because it was such a thrashing. I'm not sure that it was was the best thing. That I was trying to think of the date of the poverty of historicism, and I asked myself if in some ways Marcusa was also interested in refuting Popper, but I wasn't able to establish on time what the date. But I mean, Popper's Hegel is a fascist, but Popper's Plato is a fascist as well. So, you know, Popper in that sense is a tough now why Mr. Soros likes Popper. He likes the theory of falsifiability, and you know, certainly in the philosophy of science, that's a perfectly reasonable, rational position to represent. But what it has to do with Plato and Hegel, you know, I mean, Popper. You know, the school of logical positivism, right, in Vienna, there was always this profound hatred and competition between the Vienna and the Berlin and the Frankfurt trends. There really were. I mean, the Vienna logical positivists considered, you know, Marcuse and the rest obscurantists, and you know, it was a different mind. What you're saying about CLR, James, is very interesting. The only point that I would make is that I don't think we should be that sanguine about the critique of Soviet Marxism. I don't think we should forget it. Certainly, there were alternatives, you know, like the maybe Afro-Marxist tradition. Certainly, I didn't know much about it then. But Marcusa wrote one of the first books that was critical, and you know, that is important.
Yeah, one final thought, I suppose, really is that I suppose you could look at the Marcuse's trajectory ultimately as being one that abandons the effort of grounding anything in ontology, and moves from philosophy to critical theory, as he says very clearly in later on, and I don't think that I think that you already see that by Reason and Revolution. So I mean, I think you've already seen that in Reason and Revolution, because, as you were suggesting, he's already moved, basically saying that the heir, the proper genealogical heir here is Marxian social theory. So he's already made the move by 41, and then there's clearly no going back. Right. Well, so this has been a spectacular start to the seminar series. Thank you so much, Seyla Benhabib, for joining us. All right, and we hope to see you next week for Cornell West. All right,
Is it
take
next
care.
week or
It
the
is
week
next
after?
week.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Say what? Yeah. It'll be in Jerome Green Hall. What's the hall? What's the room? 101. 101.